You guys, I am so excited for this video because I'm going to be sharing some of the things that I really wish I had learned when I first started digital art, especially when it comes to rendering and kind of making my art look more painterly or achieving that kind of concept art type style. I love that art style, and I really think rendering goes a long way in kind of achieving that look. I'm always aiming for my videos to really help beginner artists by sharing things that I've learned throughout my art journey, and I really think the things I talk about in this video will help you, especially if you're new to digital art and rendering in general. And yeah. So first of all, what the heck is rendering? It's basically the stage of painting that takes your work from this rough, kind of ugly stage to a more finalized stage. You're refining the lines and shapes that you put in your kind of sketchy phase and making them more finished. There's usually a final stage after rendering where you might add any kind of like special effects or color balance, but some artists just stop after rendering. Usually rendering requires a lot of balance and trial and error. It's super easy to over render something and blend out all of your edges so that everything is super smooth. I ran into this a lot when I was first starting to render, and I really think it made my paintings really flat and just less interesting. So before we start rendering, usually your painting will look something kind of like this. You can see that it's basically just a pretty messy sketch still. Your line art definitely doesn't have to be perfect. Whenever you start rendering, you'll have the opportunity to kind of clean up some of these lines. But yeah, just before you start rendering, just have an idea of where you want things to be and what colors and things like that. That'll make it a little bit easier once you actually start rendering. So for my rendering process in Procreate, I first start by merging down all of my layers and creating a new layer on top to render. This took me so long to learn, and it's such a vital part of my process, really. I've seen a lot of artists do this as well, so I highly recommend trying it if you haven't already. I know some people like to work on separate layers, and I actually will work on separate layers up until the rendering stage. And then once I'm rendering, I just no longer find it necessary to keep things separate. But if you do want to keep your layers still separate, you can just create a new layer and put it above your line art. And then once we start rendering, I usually start with the face. And I'm just going to start color picking the colors that are already on my canvas. Just basically start cleaning up the edges and the lines that I have and cleaning up the sketchiness of it in general. Whenever you're rendering, another important tip that I want to point out is you want to aim for soft and hard edges. So this was a huge lesson for me to get better in my rendering process, and it was learning to keep some of the rough edges while I'm painting. And this is still something that I still struggle with and still learn, because again, you have to learn to balance it, because it's very tempting, like with the skin, for example. You know, normally, like typically the skin is very smooth, and so there's like this urge to smooth out all of the rough edges on the skin, but this actually makes it look over rendered, and then it kind of just looks like you took an airbrush to the entire thing, and it just makes your painting look flat. And so it's really important to learn to leave some of the edges rough, and I promise you this makes such a big difference in your painting. I am still experimenting with this and kind of learning the best way to do it, but I highly recommend just looking at, some of your favorite artists or even professional artists in the industry and just kind of see how they approach soft versus hard edges in their paintings and their work, and I think it'll really help. So earlier I talked about creating a new layer on top for rendering, and this is where this really comes in handy, because another thing that I'll do is I will kind of check my progress by turning that rendering layer on and off. And so I can see how much I've rendered and what my initial sketch looked like. And it kind of gives me an idea of what direction that I'm going. If I feel like I've over rendered somewhere, I can just erase it and redo it. It's important to check it pretty frequently just to kind of make sure that you're not over rendering, and it kind of helps keep you in check. So again, sometimes I'll notice that like I've gone way too far and need to scale it back. So yeah, it helps you make sure that you don't over render and make everything smooth, because it leads to a really obviously digital look. Kind of being able to turn your layer on and off of your rendering really helps with this. Another important part of the rendering process, I think, is to use textured brushes. So whenever I just lay down my flat colors, I typically use a round brush. And then once I start rendering, I like to try and incorporate more textured brushes. I love the way that it looks when a digital painting has a lot of texture and looks more like a traditional painting. So I try not to over render the texture that I'm putting down on the canvas. If you find that your paintings look super smooth and flat after you've rendered, I really recommend using more textured brushes, and just be careful not to overdo it. Just a quick thing on textured brushes, I really enjoy a lot of the brush packs from various artists that you can buy online. I think there's a lot of great textures in there, but I will say that you can get that sort of look without spending a ton of money on brushes. I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Just like, don't feel like you have to go and get a brush pack from somebody. There are a ton of texture brushes on Procreate and Photoshop that you can still use, and you can still get like a similar effect. So my final kind of tip in regards to rendering is to wait to add any sort of like special effects until you're done rendering. One thing about me, I'm a pretty impatient person, so I know that if I want like a cool glowy effect or something in a painting, I have a really hard time waiting until the final stage to add it. But honestly, it's so important to save the effects until you're done rendering, because you're gonna save so much time down the road when you decide you want to change something and you've already rendered it with the rest of the painting. Because I've done this a million times. And what I do now is I put the effect that I want to use on a layer and turn that layer off while I render. This way I don't forget it and I know that I'll come back to it, but I wait until I've already rendered everything and then start working on the effects. I just need to make sure that it's towards the final stage so that I'm not rendering with like specific colors or something that I end up changing later, because when you change something and you've already rendered it into the painting, it's really hard to like easily change it. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you find that helpful, because I've done it a million times and I just like never learn my lesson. So learn from me and just save any kind of like glowy effects and things until you're basically almost done rendering. Okay guys, I think that's pretty much gonna do it for all of my rendering advice for this video. I hope you guys found this helpful. I hope you got some use out of it. Be sure to let me know down in the comments if you have any questions or anything like that, and I can try to like better explain things. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.